Hi everyone, thanks all for joining us today for the third session in the Fintech Australia series. I'm Arabella Rothwell, the Investment Director for UK Europe, based in London, providing services to European companies looking to invest in Victoria. The Victorian Government has 23 international offices globally, providing a range of free and confidential services, including validating business opportunities, coordinating regulatory approvals, and facilitating introductions to potential partners and customers. Our office has previously supported companies such as Revolut and GoCardless enter Australia, so if you're looking at the market, please reach out. We are delighted to be joined today by Jonathan Hatch, Senior Advisor at the Innovation Hub in ASIC, who's going to talk about how ASIC works with Fintechs and about key regulations Fintechs should be aware of when looking to enter the market. On the running order, we will have a 20-minute presentation from Jonathan, followed by an audience Q&A session. We encourage you all to start posing questions to the group in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I'll now hand over to Jonathan to kick things off.
Thank you, Arabella. Hopefully everyone can hear me and this will go very smoothly. I might ask you to bring the first slide up, please. There we go. What I'm going to run through today is very broad and high level, so I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat. So I'm not ignoring you when I'm looking away constantly. It's because I'm actually going to try and watch what questions are coming in while we're doing this. But at a very high level, I aim to run through what ASIC's role is, broadly what the regulatory landscape is for financial services, and in particular how this can impact the fintech community, as well as what the Innovation Hub does, which is the Australian Securities Investments Commission's innovation support function, which is where I work. I'm going to try and cover off as much of this at a very high level very quickly as I can, because I think it's of more use. We try and focus on the questions, and where we can, I'm going to try and run through these very, very quickly, because I want to try and cover off those key points. I've already sent a quick chat message in there, so if anyone does want to send anything through to me directly, you can as well. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. Oop. Nope. One up for number two, what we will focus on today, which I partly covered off. As I mentioned, the national fintech, and also the Regtech work, because we have a particular focus on engagement in those spaces, and we have since 2015 in the case of fintech and 2016 in the case of Regtech. The reason for adding Regtech in is we've had a strong focus at ASIC, and you'll see this in the slides I use today, on our belief that the Regtech work can facilitate better consumer outcomes. This should include the broader community, and it will often, in many cases, eventuate that fintechs coming into this space will work with different parts of the Regtech community to ensure better consumer outcomes. The second bit, which I think is probably particularly relevant for this audience, is some of our international cooperation, things like the IOSCO FinTech Network, the bridging agreements, the enhanced bridging agreements, and of course, things like the Global Financial Innovation Network. Lastly, I'm going to try and cover off in the Regtech space our plans and projects for around 2020, just to give you some insights on what ASIC's looking at right now. I know some of you are probably already aware that we have a government proposed enhanced sandbox. I'll cover that one off as well. Next slide, please. Very different presenting this way. All right, at a very, very high level, the Parliament is ultimately the representative of the people, and similar to the systems you'd be familiar with. Below that, we have the financial services sector, Treasury, who are effectively coordinating what's called the Council of Financial Regulators, as you can see with the dotted line there, where we work with ourselves, obviously in ASIC, the Reserve Bank of Australia and APRA, APRA being the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, RBA being the Reserve Bank of Australia, as I mentioned. The RBA is responsible for some of the major payment facilitation, as well as the central bank currency issuing, and they coordinate things like the facilitation of the setting of the interest rates and maintaining those interest rates. What we've also got is APRA, who do the prudential work. Historically, they've also done some of the superannuation work that, however, has partially been moved over to ASIC. So if you're looking into that space, there may be some overlap. Otherwise, and just to the right on the screen, you'll see there's the competition regulator, the ACCC, who I will mention at this moment is also responsible for the Australian consumer data right, which is our version of the open banking regime. I will briefly talk to that, but ultimately, because it's not within our normal jurisdiction, it's more going to be academic than in the analysis that you may want from the ACCC themselves. There is the Australian Tax Office, which, as mentioned here, and this is a 2014 diagram, covers off tax and self-managed superannuation, which some of you may be aware we have the self-managed super fund arrangement in this country. So for those interested in that space, you'll probably also be going more in the ATO's focused jurisdiction. And then the other ones I'd mention is Australian AUSTRAC, who are the anti-money laundering body, who will look at things like counter-terrorism financing, and a lot of the ID work for in real terms for fintechs comes from obligations that are meeting AUSTRAC's obligations, which means Australia executing the FATF requirements. Lastly, on this page, you've got this OAIC, who are the privacy-focused regulator, who with the ACCC will be working on consumer data right. Going down to the bottom of the page, we have the financial system regulation and responsibilities. As mentioned, you have APRA doing the prudential work, but they also do all the data collection, which is relevant for some of the Regtechs. And if you get into the larger financial services space, you'll find that comes into your areas. Now, ASIC is the corporate and markets regulator. We also at present have the registry functions around, say, business registration, director registration, that sort of thing, and that continues in that space. We, in addition to that, will manage a lot of the, so we say, operational issues such as enforcement and working through issues that may come up, such as misleading, deceptive, or issuing of financial products. Someone just mentioned if the charts will be distributed. We do actually have a lot of these on our ASIC website already, and this particular one comes from the FSI interim report, just for those who might be looking for them. Otherwise, continuing, the RBA, as I mentioned, does payments, but the primary focus is the financial stability. So that's more the technical background, probably not as interesting, but quite important. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit more on ASIC. Well, as mentioned before, we are Australia's corporate markets, financial services and consumer regulator, which you can all read on the screen. Where that executes as an area of interest for yourselves is we are focused and have for some years now on encouraging fintechs and innovation. In our case, we've done this, with a focus on facilitating a, shall we say, roadmap and guidance for people through the regime, doing events like this, as well as direct engagement, where you can contact us via the Innovation Hub email or directly, and we can, subject to meeting certain requirements and giving you certain information, work with you to try and give you guidance where we think you might need to look from the experience of our senior staff. This is to try and help people find their way through the regime and be more compliant. Obviously, that's particularly important in the digital technology spaces, because a lot of the time when you're coding something in, it's a lot easier to know what you have to work with up front. We do this, and this is very important, while focusing on not compromising our core goals, because we need to protect investors and we want to maintain consumer trust and confidence. And that includes ensuring markets operate in a fair and transparent way, so that we do this so that consumers continue to have the faith and trust in the system, that they can comfortably deal with a financial services provider and be reassured that if something does go wrong, there are options there and they don't have to question every decision. This improves the efficiency of the financial services system, and more importantly, though it does mean we have high compliance obligations, it protects consumers and protects the financial services system more broadly. Next slide, please. Thank you. What is the Innovation Hub? And basically, what do I do each day? This is a focused system where we can try and help people navigate the regulatory systems. And that might be something simple as, how do you go around to apply for a license? You can give them guidance on that. How do things like payments work? Or we might refer them to areas such as crowdfunding and how it is executed in Australia, which there are often jurisdictional differences to other countries, including the UK. This allows businesses to understand how regulation impacts them, but more importantly, it helps us develop new policy that can support them moving forwards. Because as technology changes and as businesses start to come to us that bring new shall we say, innovations or engagement processes, then we can look at how we can better facilitate that so we can deliver consumer outcomes within the law where we can. The challenge, I'd say, is obviously going to be the balancing of our normal BAU engagement and working with our existing licensing systems, because we must maintain the integrity of the system. This comes down to a 5-step approach, which is on the next slide, please. Firstly, we do the engagement work. Things like we're looking at doing a series of meetups again, our own events, such as our Regtech liaison industry conferences. We also try and attend other events, or we can try and support industry. As long as industry comes to us with clarity on what they're wanting, we can usually work on helping support that where we can. We have a digital finance advisory panel, which has selected people from the fintech community, academia, and other regulators. This has been expanded to include some of the representatives from the Regtech community and historically members of certain technology groups, such as cybersecurity, blockchain, and artificial intelligence. We try and coordinate senior staff internally. We have what's called a hub and spoke model, where there's a few key internal people who are across each thing, including myself. And then we have senior experts from respective areas who will give guidance and support to the different, shall we say, fintechs or regtechs as they come in and want to touch on their particular ambit. This may include internal working groups or attendance with external bodies. As obviously I'm limited in what I can say, but we are attached to numerous external things. In my case, I work with Standards Australia and working on things like ethics in artificial intelligence. And separately, the innovation work, I also teach at 2 universities, one being at London School of Economics and the other being Sydney University. So we're accustomed to dealing with the questions and helping people understand what's going on. In my case as well, I just focus on most importantly here, and this is a bit of a change to what we've traditionally done, is we've designated particular information for the fintech community, where it's called effectively tailored resources, whether that be shorter things like information sheets or specific regulatory guides, so we can improve communication with industry. The other part is that we've facilitated a streamlined approach for those businesses who are in the fintech space, who are looking to be licensed. One of the advantages of working with the Innovation Hub is that it has been materially faster, in some cases up to 50% faster, for the process of getting a license by having engaged via the Innovation Hub first and having us give you guidance on what you might need within the scope that we can. We can't give you all the details. We obviously don't endorse or give legal advice or commercial advice, but we do try and help you better prepare yourselves so that the licensing process is much more efficient for us and for yourselves, which lets you get to industry much faster. This has delivered certain results, which are on the next slide, please. Which, Ian, your question is particularly timely. I only just saw it. We have 561, and this is a little old, so I'm going to say probably a few more than that now, but around 560 entities have come through. Can't actually give you a breakdown on countries in terms of where they've come from. I know we do get a fair few people coming in from overseas, partly because of the referral agreements between the regulators, and partly because I find that a lot of people, if they have an innovation support function in some form in their home country, they'll come to ASIC having a similar expectation and look to try and facilitate that moving forwards. In our case, you can see we've broken them down by the areas though. There's quite a few in the other business model. Some of those come into a range of small things like distributed ledger and that sort of thing. Others are just a smaller categories like InsurTech, which will probably break out eventually as that number grows. But you can see the dominant areas are largely Regtechs, excluding hybrid businesses, payments, because there's a lot of the people coming into that space, and we have a lot of people in the digital advisor space where they focus on delivering better consumer outcomes. What I would note, though, is in terms of countries that do come in, particularly in response to your question, Ian, is that a lot of people come in and will look at it and go, okay, we want to work with ASIC for these areas because we've been licensed in our home jurisdiction for this. Now, we have looked at trying to get licensing efficiencies. We found that there is less overlap than we expected between the different countries, but we have also found that in doing this work, a lot of people, once they've been licensed in one country, are more accustomed to the sort of questions we're going to ask. Brad, you've just asked about if there are any sectors we'd need more of. To be honest, it's a bit of a commercial call. What I will observe is if you looked at these numbers, you'll find some areas grow rapidly for a period. So we might get, and I'm thinking back to when I started, we went through a stage initially where there was a lot of marketplace lenders. Then we went through a stage with a lot of crowdsourced equity funders. Then we went through payments, a lot of them being also payments in the distributed ledger space, dropped back to then advisors, and then we went back to crowdsourced equity funding arrangements. More recently, we've had a lot more people interested in the market space, and a lot of people, particularly those wanting to use some sort of crypto or digital asset, have come into the managed investment scheme regimes. So that's been a bit of the recent history in my experience. There's been a consistent trend of Regtechs increasing, but that's because we make a lot of noise in that space, and we've been pushing in that space for a while. But we would encourage all people who are interested in coming into the spaces to come to ASIC to talk to us. In terms of consumer demand, you're going to have to work that one out yourselves in most cases. What I would note, though, is that a lot of the people coming in will assess the market and they'll go, all right, from a licensing perspective, we might want to work, say, an authorized rep or work with others as an outsource provider to them to grow experience in the local market and then get the more feet on the ground. But that's just an observation because I'm an ex-industry lawyer, so I'm a little bit more accustomed to seeing the business side as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right. I wouldn't go into too much detail here because this is the existing Sandbox, which is due to be replaced very shortly. Within the next few months, the government's expanded regulatory Sandbox is coming through. Now, this is the general one now. It's around 100 people. The new one looks to be around 100 people. The present Sandbox is a 12-month limited testing environment in effect. You can do some basic, I guess you call middleman services. Things like providing advice on existing products, referring them to a stock exchange for high liquidity shares. And it's a relatively limited scope, as you can see in the bottom corner to the left, around deposit products with a maximum balance of 10,000, that sort of thing. Now, if we can just go to the next slide quickly, which is not as interesting, but that's done deliberately because we have what's called the government's expanded regulatory sandbox. They have released the regulations. You can find these on our legislation.gov.au website. However, the final, shall we say, disclosure documents and guidance from us has not yet been released because we had to wait for the regulations to be prepared. And we're just finalizing the processes around that based on certain tests we need to work into the legislation as required by the Parliament. So once we set up those sort of structures, we'll be working through making those public. I'm going to assume because it starts in September, we'll have it sometime in August, but I wouldn't be guaranteeing that'll be the case because it will depend if there's anything that comes up between now and then. And as you'll see when I get to our Regtech work, a lot of things in this environment have been changing very rapidly. So I'm not even going to pretend that we're going through normal processes right now, but we'll just have to see how that plays out. I thought I saw another question pop up, but it seems to have disappeared. Oh, what are the usual licensing timeframes for Fintechs? There's a slide at the very end, so I'll come back to your question, Daniel, on that. I'm not going to commit to them, but we do have service standards set up online. So you can always look up the ASIC service standards, but I know we do have an amended charter for this financial year due to the present COVID circumstances. But I'll come back to that one at the end. All right. Right now, I'll just quickly run through our Regtech initiatives. This is the existing work we've done. So you can have a look at some of these videos on YouTube already. The focus has been in this space around driving interest in Regtech. Whether you want to call it promotion or facilitation, whatever else, we do a range of things. First one is the Regtech Liaison, which is a quarterly meeting that the people here could dial into if you wished. It may not be the most friendly hours, but I'm afraid that's what we've had to become accustomed to in this sort of new Zoom world. But that's the first step. That's a quarterly meeting. It's normally in person, so obviously that facilitates networking as well, where major industry players and industry bodies come. They may present. We may even get academics to come in and present on their solution or the problem they're trying to fix and how the technology they work with does it. What we try and do is keep it done in a neutral way. We don't endorse businesses if that's a strict policy of ASIC. but we do try and demonstrate what's out there so that the larger financial services sector can notice those regtechs or hybrid fintech regtechs, so they can look at what solutions can come in and what they can work with. The examples you can see here is firstly the monitoring of financial promotions. Effectively, this was set up as a problem-solving event. I know we can't use words like hackathon, but others do use things like tech sprints, where we brought in a group of regtechs to demonstrate their analysis, where they'd look at a particular data set, and it was things like photos on the side of a moving bus, and get them to analyze it for misleading deceptive statements. The next one, going downwards, is financial advice demonstration, where we were getting people to work through an existing data set of financial advice and demonstrate how they could enhance, given some of the challenges that have been seen in the Australian financial services sector, the compliance of the financial advice documentation provided to consumers, and working with identifying potentially non-compliant areas. So this ideally would work to a way so that in real time, you could have financial advisors given support for those actually using real financial, or real humans, I should say, having face-to-face meetings. Alternatively, if you had digital advice being provided, you'd be able to ensure that things aren't being missed. That's effectively a control. Voice analytics and voice-to-text trial was a more closed one, where we examined the large number of voice analytics calls, where traditionally we've had a large number of staff listening into hundreds and hundreds of voice calls and looking for particular issues and challenges, whereas this is allowing us to investigate technology that could be used to trial these systems and investigate what's possible. The only challenges we found there, and we did put this in our Regtech report number 653, where we found the data quality was a challenge. In fact, that was a challenge across all of them, except this last one, where we are looking at a licensing tool, which is effectively a chatbot, which, though we don't call it that, where people will be able to seek guidance at a basic level around what areas of licensing they might need for their particular business, obviously subject to however the information is put to them. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is the coming Regtech initiatives. I should firstly note that we were promoting 4 different initiatives. These are, I'll touch them off in a little bit more detail after, but we've had to refocus in the present environment based on industry and government feedback. Firstly, remote services and supervision, which is obviously in the present environment you'd understand is an important aspect. And secondly, we're looking at responsible lending, because it's been a major topic in Australia. Not suggesting it's an area that's needed, and it's obviously something you consider yourselves, but monitoring that lending is done correctly is something that has been raised in our Royal Commission. And if you want into other areas that are of interest in the Australian environment, I would look to the Royal Commission and some of the issues that come out from that. That will give you some insights, but this has been a large part of what we've been seeing. I'm just going to look at your questions as well on who's looking at the sandbox testing. Ian, you might need to clarify what you mean by do you have external advisors? And I'll have a look at that question when I come back to it. Moving along, if we go to the next slide, please, I'll just cover off what we were going to do. This is the original sort of Regtech work we wanted to do. With the funding, we have around $6 million from the Australian government to facilitate this. The reason we haven't gone into it is obviously the COVID circumstances, but we are looking at what we could do in this space in due course, and we're reassessing this with probable work around financial promotions. Again, voice analytics, as mentioned, basically more advanced systems and more reliable systems that can be used in real time, or at least more effectively used to assess the work. We had a look at data flow automation. We also had some work around reporting under that NLP one. And last, I'll mention, excuse me, jumping around in an awkward fashion, the NLP prospectus review. We just were looking there at disclosure documents for initial public offerings and how they can be reviewed to ensure that things are efficiently assessed. I'll just jump back up. Now, I should go to the next slide if we could. In introducing this slide, I want to emphasize that though we are net neutral from a technology perspective, we'll use this slide, and I like to bring it in because it does talk about some of the areas that are of interest to us and some of the things that people have been considering in what they brought to us. And again, though we won't endorse any technology, and we actually see the technology as more the facilitator of the compliant conduct, we have been seeing a lot of work in these spaces of recent. It doesn't mean necessarily that these are the only spaces. Sometimes some of the most simple products or services actually have been, shall we say, the most commercially successful, because they've actually found a problem that people needed fixed, and they did it in a cheaper, more efficient way. In one case I can think of, without naming the entity, they facilitated APIs in a particular space for a particular sector. That's all they did. And they've been quite successful in delivering both better consumer outcomes, which obviously we like, as well as, I believe, I may be wrong, but I'm told there's been significant cost savings for the clients. So it's not just about the technology. Obviously, technology will help you get past of a venture capitalist or angel investor if that's what your focus is. But we are more looking at the conduct and ensuring that things around the methodology is done correctly to deliver and execute effective consumer outcomes. Otherwise, the showcases in this space have usually been around developing their own products and demonstrating them to the general community. Our Regtech liaisons may take some of this work on going forwards. That will be funding dependent, but we are looking in that space. Otherwise, I might just go, I've just lost control of this end, onto our international work, which I think is probably relevant for this audience. If we go to the next slide, please. All right. In a slightly odd order, I'm going to start with the Global Financial Innovation Network. This has multiple streams. The GFIN arrangements initially was focused on effectively a global sandbox where we could test in multiple environments at once. However, that's been somewhat paused because of the circumstances many countries are in. And obviously, we've decided to focus on what is the key drivers. This has resulted in what's sometimes referred to as a SWAT team within GFIN, which I'm a member of, where we're looking at responses for COVID-19. And we've done a little bit of a summary there, but I'm going to go more broadly than this. We've also been working with Regtech work in the space and working on things like information sharing more generally. And that can involve things like working with different businesses, working to, say, trials, which we're still looking and considering different ones, either inside GFIN or outside. And we've focused on this because it's what we call a multilateral trade arrangements. Trade may not be the right word, but anyway, the focus being it facilitates access to multiple regulators at once and can drive efficiencies for industry. Now, we also have, linked to that, our existing fintech cooperation agreements. I think it's around 16 of them. Things like agreements with Singapore, the UK, other smaller countries like Kenya, all coming into the space, but they're bilateral agreements. And we've focused on them not being mutual recognition, because as I mentioned, we did look at that, but it was quite a challenging exercise because we have different assessments and different requirements. Instead, it's about facilitating efficiencies where we can and things like introductions. The other one that I'm particularly fond of, but particularly because I like to see the reports, because I think these really help industry more than people realize, is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, which is IOSCO for short, which we are a member of as we're a conduct regulator. And there's been 4 streams that we've been doing for some years, one in artificial intelligence, one in the Regtech space, one on lessons in innovation, which is probably a little bit quieter at the moment, and some other work in this area around different focuses. Now, this has partly been developed so that the regulators who've been further ahead in one area can help other regulators get ahead. But what we often deliver from this, and they're consulting right now on AI in certain spaces, is reports that are made public, which then you can get insights into what the regulators are looking into. So I find, because I both know personally some entrepreneurs and many of the people I work with via the hub, that those sorts of reports from bodies like the Global Financial Innovation Network or IOSCO can give you really useful insights into the different areas that are going on right now. Now, obviously you can subscribe, and we obviously encourage you to subscribe to things like the ASIC Innovation Hub, as well as our Regtech work. I primarily focus on the Innovation Hub moving forwards, so you can see when our events and what else is going on the news reports. But these give you certain insights that work really, really well for people who want to understand the regimes. So particularly, let's say a simple example, you might be working with machine learning in, say, advice space. If you see that the regulators are looking at it, you can start to engage with the topics early, particularly if you're looking to be, say, a Regtech as an outsource provider or a fintech facilitating this. You can look at where the solutions that you can develop or where your particular existing solution could help people meet the future or coming requirements. Can we just go to the next slide, please? On international engagement, now I've kind of covered this off a little bit, but we'll give it a little bit more focus given this is a FCA-focused event, also UK-focused event. The FCA and ASIC have entered the enhanced agreement, and we've looked at what options we have to build on this for a while. We work very closely with the FCA. Obviously, the agreement is one part of that. We'll do things like periodic calls, whether that be monthly or quarterly or whatever else. We also, I personally find, just because of the technical side, you reach out to each other fairly regularly. Obviously, there are rules around that. We can't disclose certain things. If, for example, one of you wanted the FCA to refer something to me, you have to give certain consents and vice versa. So I do find a lot of people will reach out directly. So they may circumvent the agreement, but it's still useful to you because you can do things such as working with say one regulator and say, well, we've already had this discussion with the other one. It can give us certain efficiencies, for example, in licensing and saying, all right, have you spoken to the body? What's conduct have you seen with them? How do they go about this? What issues have you had? That sort of thing. So rather than us raising concerns that may not necessarily be issues that we have to concern ourselves with as much, but it importantly allows us to develop mutual understanding of certain new technologies. How, for example, AI might be utilized in the insurtech space, or how machine learning might be used in the financial advice space, and then what limitations or ethical requirements there are. Julia, I'll deal with your question now. I'll come back to yours, Ian. On mutual recognition, this is a bit of a challenge, and I say this partly because I teach two different universities in different countries. The jurisdictional differences are more substantial than you think when you get to the nuanced level. A lot of people talk about these things being delivered very easily. They might say, well, I'm licensed in Singapore, can I be licensed in the UK and Australia? But the actual requirements in Australia might be you have to have a responsible manager, you have to have certain people on the ground, you have to have certain minimum cash requirements, and have, say, something else. Whereas in the UK, you might have certain experience requirements, you might have requirements around the entity structure, you might have requirements on how something's delivered and what insurances you might have. While in Singapore, you might have something different again. The reason I say that, in no way am I critiquing or criticizing any regime, because they all work in different backgrounds, and obviously as a lawyer I have to point out there's huge legal history attached to all these jurisdictions, but they've developed into different regimes. So ideally, yes, we would love to have one international law. There are certain structures that do facilitate this. There's the collective investment vehicle regime. There are funds passports and a few other things. And for technology, it's fairly easy, but you do need to adjust it in each space. So when I get sent overseas, because I do a lot of, it's not charity work, would be the wrong word, but I do work where we try and help some of the regulators in some jurisdictions that aren't perhaps as well resourced as, say, Australia or the United Kingdom, where we'll go out and meet with the regulatory bodies and give them experience or guidance. And given my more academic side, I'm quite comfortable doing that stuff. We might meet with them and say, this is how we'll deal with it. One of the most interesting insights I had when I was last in Vietnam, and the same thing came up when I was in Malaysia as well, was meet with multiple regulators. So the Middle Eastern regulators, completely different focus. They have a very clear focus on developing this regime around certain structures and how this could be executed. Whereas in Asia, there was a focus on assessing how certain countries would be able to cover off, say, reviewing code, which isn't something that ASIC even considers. In ASIC space, we make it clear we're a conduct regulator. If you're doing it with a fax machine or you do it by hand or you're using artificial intelligence, that's your decision. How you actually execute it, though, is something that actually comes down to where it gets interesting for us, because it's the actual outputs. A lot of people in this space, and I say this as an insight, but of more on a personal view as an insight, get very stuck on the technology. That's not always helpful. What we're looking at is a conduct. You may have the best artificial intelligence algorithm on the entire planet. If it's giving the wrong outcomes, even though it's absolutely perfect, we're still not going to be happy. Whereas someone else who has a lesser system but delivers better consumer outcomes for what it can do is something we're going to be more likely to be more comfortable with. All right. Might jump forward to the next slide, please. Engaging with the hub. Now, this is the slide we put in because I try and make it easier for you in engaging with us. As I mentioned at the start, we want to have certain information. Now, we've actually got a flowchart style diagram, or what we call infographic, on the Innovation Hub website you can find very easily. It's around seeking advice for either Fintechs, you go down one guides, or Regtech, go down another one. Each one has a link to a form. What I would strongly suggest is trying to set out at least basic guidance. I mean, I don't need you to write a PhD thesis on why your innovation is important and its impacts, nor do I want your shareholder slide pack. It's useful insights, but it's not material necessarily. What we need to understand is, I wouldn't even focus that much on being a startup because we're pretty open on that one, is what is your innovation, what you're doing, why you think it's different, who you're working with. So in that case, what are the target consumers? Well, that's what we mean when we say who are you helping, and why your particular innovation is different from the existing regime, because we're less interested in, say, dealing with another financial advisor doing the exact same thing as 500 other people. Whereas if you're coming in using, say, technology to develop a platform to do something, we'd be interested. Example might be in the insurtech space, or actually I'll take it back. My background's actually in our superannuation regime as a lawyer. So if you're coming into the superannuation space, you might say we're interested in doing, say, particular pensions, and we want to help consumers by building a financial advice structure into that for elderly consumers who might struggle to otherwise budget and facilitate what's best in their interests. And we work with blah, 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 and blah. That's something that may be interesting to us. And then we want to understand what the regulatory issues you're facing. Now, it doesn't have to be complete and detailed. We just want to have a basic, or we want you to have a basic understanding that you've done some basic work. The reason we ask for that is that we find some people don't necessarily prepare themselves as well as we'd like them to, and we try and focus on having one meeting with an individual rather than having multiple. And then ideally, we'd like to see some of the discussion around the benefits and the risks of your solution, just to show you actually have turned your minds to it. Now, I've got a slide on the next slide, which is usually where I just sort of ad lib and go through some of the issues around the challenges and opportunities in the space. I might just quickly jump back to the questions for a moment because I missed your one, Ian. You asked if it's regulatory staff or an advisory expert panel. Earlier on, I mentioned the Digital Finance Advisory Panel. That is external panel, a major mix of industry representatives, industry advocacy bodies, some academia, and we also have people coming in from the other regulators or government bodies. That's the sort of guiding and insight body for the Innovation Hub. The Innovation Hub itself is primarily, it's been historically, my cat's just decided to invade the meeting. Historically, it's been around myself and usually one other person. That other person's changed over time, who provide the guidance. Now, my background is a financial services lawyer. I obviously do academic work as well, and I've been at the Regulator for some time now. But we try and give it, in this example, industry-focused solution work, but we don't give commercial legal advice, and we don't endorse anyone. So I just have to give those caveats again and again, because we have had quite a few people trying to either get endorsement or perhaps inadvertently being overly optimistic about our commentary. So I just want to give that as a general observation. In terms of the actual work with the Sandbox and external advisors, I have seen external advisors coming into the Sandbox, but the actual assessment process is done by the ASIC itself, because it's kind of akin to a licensing environment or a licensing style thing, even though it's not a license. I need to emphasize that. So when you go to actually put a submission in, we're not going through, say, industry individuals who could have a view on what you're doing. Instead, it's going through ASIC staff. The reason for that is it was set up as a way of us assessing the very basic structures. It's not designed, excuse me, just grabbing something, to be a full assessment of what you're doing, nor an endorsement. It's just testing if you're hitting certain minimum requirements as set out in the legislation. So it's unlikely you'd necessarily go to the model where some of the innovation support functions internationally have had an expert or consultative panel on what is innovation. We've tried to be fairly lenient with that, so we're not sort of saying no, but we would potentially still look to say no if somebody that couldn't articulate what they're doing, and you'd be surprised how common that is, or they're coming into us and they're just trying to do what everyone else is already doing. Now, what I mean by that is if someone came in and said, provide an exact same service for something that already existed and has existed for, say, decades, that's of less innovative nature, or less innovative than, say, someone else who may do the same services but use new technology or more efficient solutions or something on those lines. It's very early stages, so I'm sort of making up sort of a guess of where it could land and ultimately, we'll give more guidance, I suspect, as we work through that in due course. With in response to your question, Duncan, happy to take direct questions. I find that people come in a range of ways. I've had everything from people approaching me on LinkedIn. It happens surprisingly a lot. I always encourage people to email my ASIC email, which I put at the back of the slides, or you can approach via the Innovation Hub email, and I or the present other advisor, his name's George, would respond to you in due course. Particularly if you look at the enhanced regulatory sandbox, one of us will come back to you in due course, but noting it is very early stages. We try and respond fairly quickly. It's not always the case, but the more information you give us, particularly if you complete the application form when you're approaching us, and I would always encourage you to email that through the Innovation Hub if you are. Happy for you to address it to me, but send us the Innovation Hub email for records purposes, is that we can understand better what you're doing. The more information you give us, the quicker we can respond to you. There may be busy periods. For example, our financial year has just ended, so we've been quite busy. So I have still a few entities to catch up on, but we are happy to engage. What other questions are there? I think that's most of them responded to. Just checking. Feel free to pester me if I've missed any. Oh, Daniel, your question on licensing time frameworks. If we could just, I'm going to be really annoying. Can you just drop down to the last slide? It has the ASIC charter numbers. So 23, yep. This is a slide, and you can see I've deliberately left the old date in the bottom corner because it is an old one. But the normal processes under our normal service charter, i.e. when conduct is going under normal standards, was historically 70% of the applications within 150 days and 90% within 240 calendar days. Now, I'm not going to guarantee that's always going to be the case, but it is what we've been trying to focus on delivering. If we could just go back to the slide number, what is this, 18, just so people can see the details from me. All right. Can I ask, and I'll probably encourage to try and get people to get the questions out, were there other questions coming through? Either or other things people wanted to discuss with me. I can run through more high-level matters about how the industry is structured, but I would want to see if there's questions, because I find the questions are often more useful. All right, next question is from Trading Hub HK. Can you say more about existing upcoming initiatives of ASIC for Regtech firms like yourselves? I actually don't know what you are, but I'll just give some general commentary. And where we don't require licensing. Regtechs, I'll just observe, generally are less likely to need licensing, but it doesn't mean you won't. So you saw me saying before that you would have heard me saying before, sometimes you see fintech Regtech hybrids. An example might be someone coming into the market space where they sit there and go, all right, I'm going to provide a market facilitation service. They happen to need a market license under our regimes. Another one might be if you're facilitating payments, we have a non-cash payment facility arrangement. It's not like the e-money arrangements in the UK, so it's something that's relatively unique to Australia. If you are in the payment space, have a look at our regulatory guide number 185. That's RG 185 from ASIC. That'll give you some guidance there. But up and coming events, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown again of the Regtech work generally. Firstly, the Regtech liaisons. Quarterly, if you subscribe to Innovation Hub, you will get the emails for that as well. That's the big one that we try and bring industry participants together as well as existing clients potentially for you, where people can either present sometimes or they can deliver or see what others deliver in terms of solutions. Often this involves an industry body presenting on some of their work. We may do some more academic work in that space, including some colleagues of mine from the UK, who are looking to present on some of the mutual work that the regulators have done. Secondly, and there's a big step in this space, we've been doing the Regtech initiatives. Now, we've had funding which would have technically expired yesterday. No, expired 2 days ago, sorry. And that was for the $6 million to Regtech initiatives. Now, some of that involved, excuse my cat again, working on how people work with industry and the different drivers we put up. What I'd suggest if you want to look at the Regtech initiatives and the Regtech trials is have a look at the Regtech web pages from ASIC that have been traditionally for last year of the Regtech initiatives. Prior to that, we did natural language processing trials, which I didn't mention, but we focused those on how natural language could be used for Regtech or subtech purposes. And for our definition of separation, subtech to me is more when you look at something that's purely built for regulators. Regtech is when you start building a solution that works for regulators and for industry, or just for industry. So that's sort of the Regtech space. On the not requiring licensing, I just want to touch on that one again. Often the way people avoid it when they're in the Regtech space is you actually put the burden onto your client. If I was back in an industry role as a lawyer, what I might be doing if I was working for a Regtech is saying, we are an outsource provider. APRA does give some guidance on outsource providing or provision. I think it's CPS 232, if I remember correctly, or 234, but don't quote me because I'm not an APRA lawyer. The background there is that generally you can provide services to someone who's licensed, and those services are things that they take responsibility for as part of their licensing requirements, and you just help them deliver it in a more efficient way. Obviously, there's some commercial questions around liability, work between parties, but that's just a general high-level answer. That I think's most of it. I'm just going to look at your question, Sarah. Yes, the 16 countries are online. I'll just check and make sure the web page is still up. 6 agreements, ASIC Innovation Hub. The agreements, though, are come in different forms. So some of the agreements are referral, some of them are purely information sharing. It does depend a little bit on the nature of the particular, shall we say, agreements or approach that the relevant regulators are using. Some regulators can do referrals, others can't. Again, it comes down to those jurisdictional backgrounds. If you search Innovation Hub International Cooperation, you'll see the International Request Agreement, and you'll see there's referral information sharing agreements, pure information exchange agreements, and some regulatory bodies, for example, Japan, doesn't actually do agreements, so we have a cooperation framework via an exchange of letters. Other countries include Canada, Hong Kong, Luxembourg, Singapore, Switzerland, the UAE, obviously the UK, United States, CFTC, China, Indonesia, and Kenya, and of course Japan, as I mentioned. Were there other questions? I'm mindful of the time as well. I'll just mention in terms of the development in the Australian financial services space, there's always been a lot of interest in coming into this market. We have a very strong pool of superannuation funds, so they have had some interesting experiences with recent government policy around early release for certain individuals who have been suffering or struggling and needed to have withdrawals. There was a $10,000 last financial year, which ended on 30 June, and potentially another $10,000 withdrawal this particular one. Well, I can see another question coming through. But I also mentioned we've had a lot of arrangements around things like what we call job seeker, which is effectively payments for the unemployed who are looking for support while they're looking, i.e. seeking a job. We've also had the government arrangements around job keeper for businesses who've had small businesses with a 30% reduction, big businesses who do a 50% decline. And I can see certain things popping up in the chat. I'm just going to check what other questions there are. Just a moment. All right, thank you, Arabella. One of the questions that did come up, and I do remember seeing this one in the email, was how ASIC ensures investment firms are meeting regulatory reporting, i.e. shareholder disclosing. We have a risk-based assessment model, and that means a very short version of a whole pile of different inputs coming in. Sometimes it's data analytics, sometimes it's some of the Regtech and subtech systems we use. It's also an element of the people who are facilitating exchanges or facilitating access to those products have certain obligations around reporting conduct issues. For example, I used to work in a superannuation platform. I also worked in an investor-directed portfolio service, which is where investors can pick their own investments and the facilitator holds those investments on their behalf. In the IDPS and the superannuation fund, potentially you could see off certain obligations being there around disclosure being provided. So if someone wasn't meeting certain requirements, that could be an issue that may need to be reported to the regulator. There's also requirements to lodge certain documents periodically, so we'd notice if you weren't lodging things. In other cases, you might lodge them in advance. For example, if you're registering a managed investment scheme, you might have to lodge historically, say, the custody of the compliance plan and the trust deeds and other agreements, just to evidence they're there. We may raise queries or questions around them. My former team used to do that, so I'm quite accustomed to that. In terms of digitization of focus in this particular space, I think it depends what space you're looking at. So I know there's quite questions around Australian firms and compliance, but compliance can take so many different forms. In my own career, I've covered off things like substantial shareholding. I've covered off other areas such as market conduct, compliance, ethical reporting, but that doesn't cover anything like the entire sphere. You will have compliance in all sorts of different spaces. In Australia, there's a lot of different regulators you might have to deal with at different points in time. For example, if you had a science-based company, you might do, let's say you're developing a vaccine for COVID and you managed to successfully do it. You might have to report to the stock exchange that you have news. You might have to report to certain regulators around how the conduct works and how the systems work. For example, science-based ones, ISO standards, that sort of thing. And you might have certain consumer protections around, say, pricing or whatever else, just as a simple made-up example. Emphasis on, I don't know that area, so I could be completely wrong. But it does cover up the general obligations. Topics that we are concerned about during these unprecedented times. There's a lot of different topics. What I'd be referring to for those who are looking at what's concerning ASIC right now is going to fundamentally drop back to our traditional mandate. Our interim plan, which was released a few months back, if you look at the website, it has a revised timetable, does deal with some of the questions around timing and some of our present focus. It's actually a relatively short document. You can skim it fairly quickly. It's about 20 pages long. And it just covers around basic elements like consumers at heightened vulnerability times. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people who may need financial advice or support at these times. There's maintaining, obviously, the stability of the financial markets. Obviously, that's important for every country on the planet right now. Supporting businesses through their particular arrangements. And we will have an ongoing focus on reducing red tape, but we've also ideally looking to disrupt bad action in the space. As you'd expect, and I believe this has been reported by international regulators, there's been an element of people coming into the spaces and perhaps acting with conduct we'd prefer they didn't, right through to people just blatantly committing fraudulent sort of transactions, or they're trying to do the sort of prints from some country saying, give us money or whatever else. All these challenges are coming too, so we want to continue maintaining normal services, but intervene when we need to if there's problems, particularly those targeting individuals in need who may be desperate and may not have their guard up as high as they should in dealing with, say, new products or investments. They're just some of the broader ones. There's a lot of stuff. Have a look at the guide. We've talked about our planning processes. We've talked about how consumer vulnerabilities are a concern for us. Each area has particular elements we've covered off, things like people going to superannuation, disrupting mis-selling of information on the markets, that sort of thing. And it's just have a look through the guide. It's really, really easy. I'll be giving you a lot of clarity around that stuff. Last question here was clarifying the timing and the criteria of international platforms for data tests in the Sandbox and the C consumer data right platform. Okay, Sandbox, one arrangement, that's with ASIC. Consumer data right, separate arrangement under the ACCC. The only reason consumer data rights locked into financial services is it's starting in that space. So what's happening is the Australian Consumer Competition Commission are coordinating this because it will be a consumer data right. The difference being that it's not the bank who owns your data, it's you as a consumer. So you can go in and say, we want to look at particular areas. And this really helps the fintechs when it is finalized. It will help the fintechs, I should say. So because a consumer could come to you and say, if you're providing financial advice, provide the details of all your their transaction history rather than having to use services like screen scraping, which obviously the banks and other institutions are very good at blocking, or using services that may otherwise collect information in inappropriate ways, or ways that we don't have a view on screen scraping, I need to emphasize, but ways that consumers may not necessarily like. For example, having to email all your statements to someone is not something that necessarily is great from a privacy perspective or security perspective. So in that particular space, what we've been working on is being involved in the consumer data right, but we're not directly coordinating it. It has been pushed back once or twice now. The start date was actually yesterday. There's a bit of commentary around that. That primarily was around a small number of entities, and some major players are capable of sharing their information, largely between themselves. Due to the lobbying processes, there's been quite a lot of pressure on cybersecurity elements. The fintech community, without expressing a view either way, have expressed that it does make it harder because you have to meet certain standards. I would say, coming into this expecting you have to be fairly secure and maintain very high cybersecurity standards in coming into the space. I don't think that would surprise anyone here, but I know that there has been a lot of debate about this. You can find it online if you want commentary. We don't express a view either way, other than it relates to certain information. It will expand into other areas. I think it's starting off with the basic data around ADI, i.e. bank data. And from I think it's 1 November, you'll be able to share things such as consumer home loan data, investment loans, so things like margin loans, personal certain loans. I can't remember the exact details on the personal loans, and arrangements around credit and debit cards and joint accounts. So the credit and debit cards, I think, actually work from now. The idea is it gives consumers control over their own data rather than, say, the existing institutions, and lets people have a better picture of what they're dealing with themselves so they can get better informed advice for their circumstances. There's a lot of work on business reporting. What I would suggest is, if you have questions, look at consumer data right in the ACCC, just search in Google or whatever your search engine is. And there's a general inquiry page there which will help you. There's also a video, or they've actually got regular videos up that can work through it, and they can give you some support. Also have a look at the OAIC, and separately to the data standards body, which is facilitated through the our Data 61, which is part of the CSIRO, which is the science arm of the government, after getting all that out, where they work through different particular things. I just noticed another question from yourself, Sarah. The Innovation Hub events, yes, anyone can attend. We, as a principle, on principle, make them free to attend. There have been certain exceptions where we've had to work with private data. We haven't been able to do that, but that's pretty rare. Normally, all events are made public, and you can actually look them up on YouTube and watch the videos should you really wish to watch them and see what people are doing. That's one particular space. The only other exception I can think of is if people want to approach the Innovation Hub, obviously we aren't going to film that, put up online. Things like this might be up online, but generally you'll find there's not a lot of stuff that's when it's one-on-one due to their security obligations. Just on that, I should note we have a lot of obligations around security of information. As I mentioned before, we can't just forward your information. We need consent. It's under Section 127 of the ASIC Act. It comes from, is where no obligations come from. It gives you certain security, but also means we don't do things like NDAs, just so you're prepared for that sort of space, because the law already sets out similar standards. That's probably all the questions I can see right now. I'm just going to bring up the chat again, see any other questions I've missed. The charts are online. These are standard slides, Marcus. I've deliberately used largely the same ones. Have a look at the Innovation Hub website. I'm not sure if Victoria can, Invest Victoria can do anything to distribute directly. Let me check on that one.
We'll distribute afterwards.
All right. I'll get you to chop off those extra ones because I'm not into using out-of-date slides. Just my non-compliant nature means we'll chop those ones off the end of the PDF, or I can do that for you. I think I've covered off any of the questions. If there's anything anyone feels I've missed, please let me know.
I think we'll finish there given the time, but I just want to say a big thank you, Jonathan, for this evening and for all the advice and insights you've provided, particularly on ASIC's priorities and how best to engage with you. So thank you. The final session in the series is next Thursday, the 9th of July. This session is a chance to hear from some of the incumbents in the market about their priorities and how they work with fintechs. So we will be joined by representatives from one of Australia's largest banks, NAB, and Australia's largest superannuation fund, Australian Super. So we'll register the links, we'll circulate the links to register and also the recording of this shortly, along with the slides. But thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy your evening or your morning, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you.
Thank you all. Feel free to reach out, guys.